Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to the sky.
We must protect it.
As a child, she would lie on her back in the grass behind her grandmother's house, watching clouds drift across the endless blue canvas above. Her grandmother, Elena, would sit beside her, telling stories of brave women who had served their country during wartime. These weren't the usual bedtime stories most children heard. Elena's tales were filled with real women who had worked in factories, served as nurses, and even taken on dangerous missions that history books rarely mentioned. Mija, Elena would say in her soft voice, still carrying traces of her native Spanish accent, "Women have always been guardians, even when the world doesn't see us. We protect what matters most, even when no one is watching." Sarah never fully understood what her grandmother meant, but those words stayed with her like a compass pointing toward her future. Now, at 26, Sarah found herself living those words every day. She stood at her post at Randolph Air Force Base, her uniform crisp and pressed, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. As an air traffic control specialist, she was responsible for the safety of every aircraft that entered and left the airspace around the base. It was a job that demanded absolute focus, split-second decision-making, and nerves of steel. One mistake could mean the difference between life and death for the pilots who trusted her voice to guide them safely home. The base was a bustling hub of activity. Fighter jets roared overhead during training exercises, their engines creating a symphony of power that never failed to make Sarah's heart race. Transport planes lumbered across the runway like gentle giants, carrying supplies and personnel to destinations around the world. Helicopters buzzed in and out like mechanical hummingbirds, their rotors chopping through the air with rhythmic precision. Through it all, Sarah remained steady at her post, her voice calm and confident as she guided each aircraft to safety. Her colleagues respected her dedication and skill. Captain Rodriguez, her supervisor, often praised her ability to remain calm under pressure. "Martinez," he would say, "you have something special. You don't just do this job, you feel it in your bones. The pilots trust you because they can hear the certainty in your voice. That's not something you can teach." Sarah took pride in her work, but she also carried a deeper sense of purpose that she couldn't quite explain. Every time she guided a pilot safely to the ground, she felt connected to something larger than herself. It was as if she was continuing a family tradition of service that stretched back generations, even though her grandmother had never served in the military. Elena had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving behind a small wooden box that she had instructed Sarah to open only when the time was right. Sarah kept the box on her dresser, but had never felt compelled to open it. Elena had been full of mysterious sayings and cryptic advice, and Sarah assumed this was just another one of her grandmother's quirky habits. Still, she couldn't bring herself to ignore her grandmother's final wish, so the box remained unopened, waiting for whatever moment Elena had envisioned. The base itself had a rich history dating back to the 1930s. It had served as a training ground for pilots during World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. The walls of the operations center were lined with photographs of aviators from different eras, their faces young and determined, frozen in time before they took to the skies in service of their country. Sarah often found herself studying these photographs during quiet moments, wondering about the stories behind each face. One photograph in particular always caught her attention. It showed a group of women in military uniforms from the 1940s, standing in front of a small aircraft. Their faces were serious but confident, and there was something in their eyes that reminded Sarah of her grandmother. The nameplate below the photograph simply read Women Air Force Service Pilots, Class of 1943. Sarah had researched the WASPs online and learned about their incredible contributions during World War II, but she never imagined that her own family might have any connection to these pioneering women. Her daily routine was precise and methodical. She arrived at the base each morning at 0600 hours, checked the weather reports, reviewed the flight schedules, and prepared her equipment for the day ahead. The control tower was her domain, a glass-walled sanctuary that offered a panoramic view of the entire base. From her position, she could see everything: the mechanics working on aircraft engines, the ground crews directing planes to and from their parking spots, the pilots conducting their pre-flight inspections with meticulous care. The work was demanding, but Sarah thrived under pressure. Radio communications crackled constantly in her headset, pilots checking in for landing instructions, requesting permission for takeoff, or reporting their positions during flight exercises. She managed multiple aircraft simultaneously, creating an invisible web of safe passage through the crowded airspace around the base. Her computer screens displayed radar contacts as small blips of light, each one representing human lives that depended on her expertise to keep them safe. During her breaks, Sarah would often walk the perimeter of the base, breathing in the smell of jet fuel and aviation oil that seemed to permeate everything. The fence line offered a different perspective on the base's operations. She could watch the maintenance crews at work, see the precision of the flight line operations, and observe the constant ballet of aircraft movements that made the base function like a well-oiled machine. It was during one of these walks that she first noticed the elderly man who would change her life forever. He appeared one Tuesday afternoon, walking slowly along the public side of the fence with the help of a polished wooden walking stick. His posture was upright despite his age, and his gray hair was neatly trimmed in a military style. He wore a simple civilian jacket, but there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of a lifetime of military service. The man stopped at a particular section of fence and stood there for several minutes, staring at the flight line with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. It might have been nostalgia, or sadness, or perhaps something deeper. He seemed lost in memories that only he could see, watching the modern aircraft with eyes that had probably witnessed decades of aviation history. Sarah found herself curious about the stranger. Visitors to the base were common, especially retired military personnel who came to reminisce about their service days. But there was something different about this man. He didn't have the casual demeanor of a tourist or the excited energy of someone showing the base to family members. Instead, he stood with the quiet intensity of someone searching for something specific, something important. Over the following weeks, the man returned regularly, always to the same spot along the fence. Sarah began timing her breaks to coincide with his visits, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity about his story. She noticed that he always carried a small leather portfolio under his arm, and sometimes he would open it and study its contents while watching the aircraft operations. His visits followed a pattern. He would arrive around 1,400 hours, stand at the fence for exactly 30 minutes, and then walk away with the same measured pace with which he had arrived. Sarah's colleagues began to notice her interest in the mysterious visitor. "Who's the old man?" asked Sergeant Williams one afternoon as they watched him through the control tower windows. "Looks like he's casing the joint." "I don't think so," Sarah replied, though she couldn't explain why she felt so certain. "I think he's looking for something. Or maybe someone." Captain Rodriguez joined their conversation, following their gaze to the figure by the fence. "Probably just another retired pilot reliving his glory days. We get a lot of them. Sometimes they stand out there for hours, watching the young hotshots and remembering when they were the ones burning up the sky." But Sarah knew it was more than that. There was something about the man's presence that felt significant, as if his daily vigil was connected to something important that she couldn't yet understand. She found herself looking forward to his visits, using his arrival as a marker in her daily routine. When he didn't appear on schedule, she worried that something might have happened to him. When he returned the next day, she felt relief wash over her like a warm tide. The mystery deepened when Sarah realized that the man wasn't just watching the aircraft randomly. His attention seemed focused on specific types of planes, particularly the older training aircraft that were used for basic pilot instruction. These weren't the glamorous fighter jets that captured most visitors' attention, but rather the workhorses of military aviation, sturdy, reliable aircraft that had been teaching pilots the fundamentals of flight for decades. Sarah's grandmother had often told her that everything in life was connected, that seemingly random events were actually part of a larger pattern that only became clear with time and perspective. As she watched the elderly stranger maintain his quiet vigil day after day, she began to wonder if his presence at the base might be connected to her own journey in some way that she couldn't yet comprehend. The wooden box on her dresser seemed to call to her more insistently now, as if her grandmother's spirit was trying to tell her that the time Elena had spoken of was finally approaching. But Sarah resisted the urge to open it, trusting that she would know the right moment when it arrived. In the meantime, she continued her work with renewed dedication, guiding aircraft safely through the sky while keeping one eye on the mysterious figure who had become an unexpected part of her daily routine. Little did she know that within days, a chance encounter would reveal connections that stretched back across decades, linking her family's hidden history to the very base where she now served. The Guardian of the Sky was about to discover that she was not the first woman in her family to watch over aircraft and the brave souls who flew them. The morning of Thursday, October 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at the base before dawn, the sky still painted in deep purples and oranges as the sun crept over the horizon. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and a light breeze carried the familiar scents of the airfield, jet fuel, metal, and the faint smell of coffee from the operations building. She had just finished her morning briefing when Captain Rodriguez approached her desk with an unusual request. "Martinez, I need you to handle some VIP coordination today. We've got a group of retired officers coming in for a memorial dedication ceremony. Some of these guys are real old-timers, World War II and Korea veterans. I want our best people handling their visit." Sarah felt honored by the assignment. Working with veterans was always meaningful, but there was something special about meeting the men and women who had served during the great conflicts that had shaped the modern world. These were living pieces of history, walking repositories of stories and experiences that couldn't be found in any textbook. The ceremony was scheduled for 1,500 hours, which meant Sarah would need to coordinate her regular air traffic duties with the additional responsibility of ensuring the visiting veterans had everything they needed. The memorial they were dedicating honored pilots who had made the ultimate sacrifice during training exercises at the base over the past 8 decades. It was a solemn reminder that even in peacetime, military aviation carried inherent risks that demanded respect and remembrance. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed increased activity around the base. Ground crews were preparing a special parking area for the visitors, and maintenance teams were giving extra attention to the aircraft that would be displayed during the ceremony. The base's public affairs office had set up a small media area where local reporters would cover the event. Everything had to be perfect for the veterans who were returning to honor their fallen comrades. Around noon, the first group of visitors began arriving. Sarah watched from the control tower as cars pulled up to the main gate, their occupants moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity. Even from a distance, she could see the careful way they walked, the straight bearing of their shoulders, and the quiet reverence in their manner. These were men and women who had faced danger with courage, and time had only deepened their understanding of sacrifice and service. The elderly man she had been watching for weeks arrived precisely at his usual time, but today was different. Instead of standing alone by the fence, he was part of the official visitor group. Sarah felt a flutter of excitement as she realized she might finally learn something about the mysterious stranger who had captured her curiosity. Through her binoculars, she could see him more clearly than ever before. He wore a dress uniform adorned with ribbons and medals, his gray hair gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The walking stick he carried was polished to a high shine, and his bearing commanded the respect of everyone around him. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through her radio. "Martinez, I need you down here for a few minutes. We're doing introductions with the veteran group, and I want them to meet some of our active duty personnel. Sergeant Johnson can cover the tower while you're gone." Sarah made her way downstairs, her heart beating faster than usual. She had met many veterans during her time at the base, but something about today felt different, more significant. As she approached the group gathered near the memorial site, she could hear fragments of conversation, stories about training exercises from decades past, names of pilots who had served with distinction, memories of aircraft that no longer existed except in the minds of those who had flown them. Captain Rodriguez spotted her approaching and waved her over. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet one of our finest air traffic controllers, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez. She's been with us for 3 years now, and she has one of the best safety records in the wing." The veterans nodded approvingly, and several stepped forward to shake her hand. Sarah felt humbled by their attention, knowing that these men had faced challenges and dangers that made her own service seem comfortable by comparison. But, as she moved through the group, exchanging pleasantries and listening to their stories, she found herself drawn toward the elderly man she had been observing for weeks. When she finally stood before him, something extraordinary happened. His eyes met hers, and she saw a look of shock cross his weathered features. His face went pale, and, for a moment he seemed unable to speak. Then, without warning, his walking stick slipped from his fingers and clattered to the concrete pavement. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the bass. "It can't be." Sarah bent down to retrieve his walking stick, concerned by his obvious distress. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" The old man stared at her as if he were seeing a ghost. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted his walking stick back, and, when he spoke, his voice was filled with wonder and disbelief. "What did you say your name was, young lady?" "Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, sir. I work in air traffic control here at the base." "Martinez," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of it. "Tell me, what was your grandmother's name?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The question seemed to come from nowhere, yet something in the man's tone suggested it was the most important question in the world. "Elena Martinez, sir. She passed away 3 years ago." "Why do you ask?" The elderly man closed his eyes for a long moment, and, when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Elena Vasquez, before she married?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her grandmother's maiden name had indeed been Vasquez, but she had never mentioned it to anyone at the base. How could this stranger possibly know such personal information about her family? "Yes, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "How did you know that?" Instead of answering immediately, the man reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather portfolio Sarah had seen him carrying during his previous visits. With shaking hands, he opened it and removed a black and white photograph that had been yellowed by age. He held it out to her, and Sarah gasped when she saw it. The photograph showed a young woman in a World War II-era flight suit, standing beside a small training aircraft. The woman was beautiful, with dark hair pulled back in victory rolls and eyes that sparkled with confidence and determination. But what took Sarah's breath away was the face looking back at her from the photograph. It was her own face, or at least it could have been. The resemblance was so striking that they could have been twins separated by 70 years. "This is Elena Vasquez," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved my life in 1943, and I've been looking for her ever since." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandmother had never mentioned serving during World War II, had never spoken of being a pilot or having any connection to military aviation. The woman in the photograph was clearly a member of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the same group Sarah had seen represented in the framed photograph in the operations center. But Elena had always presented herself as a simple immigrant woman who had worked in factories during the war before marrying Sarah's grandfather and raising a family. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her mind reeling with the implications. "My grandmother never told me she was a pilot. She never mentioned serving in the military at all." The elderly man studied her face with intense curiosity, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him for decades. "She wouldn't have," he said finally. "The WASPs were classified for years after the war ended. Many of the women who served were told never to speak about their experiences. They disappeared back into civilian life, and their contributions were forgotten by everyone except the men whose lives they saved." Other veterans had begun to gather around them, drawn by the obvious emotional intensity of the conversation. Captain Rodriguez approached, looking concerned about the elderly man's obvious distress. But Sarah barely noticed the growing crowd. Her entire world had narrowed to the photograph in her hands and the incredible revelation that her grandmother had been a military pilot. "Tell me about her," Sarah whispered. "Tell me how she saved your life." The old man straightened his shoulders, and suddenly, Sarah could see the young pilot he had once been, hidden beneath the accumulated years. "My name is General Robert Hayes, retired," he said formally. "In 1943, I was Lieutenant Bobby Hayes, and I was learning to fly at a training base in Texas. Your grandmother was my instructor pilot, one of the few women who were allowed to teach combat pilots how to handle their aircraft. She was the best pilot I ever flew with, and on August 23, 1943, she pulled me out of a burning airplane and saved my life." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. Her grandmother's mysterious past was being revealed by a man who had carried her memory for over 70 years. The wooden box on her dresser suddenly made sense. Elena had known this moment would come, had somehow anticipated that the truth about her service would eventually surface. "I've been coming to military bases for decades," General Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared his long-held secret. "I was looking for any trace of her, any record of her service. The military files were classified, and most of the WASPs disappeared after the war without leaving any forwarding addresses. I knew she had married someone named Martinez, but there were so many Martinez families that I never found the right one. Until today, when I saw you standing there wearing her face like a gift from heaven." The other veterans murmured among themselves, sharing their own stories of pilots who had trained them, saved them, or served alongside them. Sarah realized that her encounter with General Hayes was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of wartime service and sacrifice that connected generations of military families. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of amazement and professional curiosity. "General Hayes, this is quite a story. Are you saying that Sergeant Martinez's grandmother was one of the original WASPs?" "Not just one of them," General Hayes replied, his voice filled with pride and reverence. "Elena Vasquez was one of the best pilots of her generation. She could fly anything with wings, and she had a gift for teaching nervous young men how to stay alive in the air. If it hadn't been for her, I never would have made it through training, never would have flown combat missions in the Pacific, never would have lived to become the pilot and officer that I eventually became." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, all of them focused on the remarkable story unfolding before them. She felt as if she had stepped through a door into an alternate version of her family history, one filled with heroism and service that had been hidden from her for her entire life. The grandmother she had known as a gentle storyteller who made the best tamales in the neighborhood had actually been a pioneering aviator who had helped train the pilots who won World War II. As the implications of this revelation began to sink in, Sarah realized that her own calling to serve in military aviation was not a coincidence but a continuation of a family tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of women in military service. The voice she used to guide pilots safely to the ground carried the same DNA as the voice that had once coached young men through their first solo flights and emergency procedures. General Hayes invited Sarah to sit with him on a nearby bench while the other veterans continued their preparations for the memorial ceremony. The leather portfolio in his lap contained what appeared to be a lifetime's worth of carefully preserved documents, photographs, and personal mementos. Sarah could see that this meeting was as important to him as it was shocking to her. "I need to tell you the whole story," he began, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he opened the portfolio. "Your grandmother deserves to have her heroism known, even if it's 78 years too late." Sarah nodded, still struggling to process the magnitude of what she was learning. The grandmother she had known had been warm, nurturing, and full of stories about strong women, but she had never hinted at her own extraordinary past. Now, sitting in the shadow of the very aircraft that represented the continuation of her grandmother's legacy, Sarah prepared to learn about a side of Elena she had never imagined. "It was August 23, 1943, General Hayes began, his eyes taking on the distant look of someone traveling back through decades of memory. "I was 19 years old, cocky as hell, and convinced I was going to be the greatest fighter pilot who ever lived. The truth is, I was barely competent enough to keep myself alive in a training aircraft, let alone face combat against experienced enemy pilots." He pulled out a faded training document that showed his flight records from that period. Sarah could see her grandmother's signature on several entries, along with comments written in her careful handwriting. "Student shows improvement in emergency procedures. Needs additional work on instrument flying. Recommended for continued training." Elena was tough, General Hayes continued, a slight smile crossing his face. "She didn't tolerate mistakes, didn't accept excuses, and she had a way of seeing through any attempt to hide incompetence behind false confidence. But she also had infinite patience for students who were genuinely trying to improve. She could take a pilot who was afraid of his own shadow and turn him into someone who could handle any emergency situation." Sarah studied the training records, amazed to see her grandmother's professional handwriting documenting the progress of young pilots who would soon be heading into combat. Each entry represented hours of flight time, careful instruction, and the gradual building of skills that would mean the difference between life and death in aerial combat. "The WASPs weren't supposed to be flying combat missions," General Hayes explained, "but they were doing everything else. They ferried new aircraft from factories to military bases, towed targets for gunnery practice, tested repaired aircraft to make sure they were safe for combat pilots, and trained thousands of male pilots in every aspect of military aviation. Your grandmother was particularly skilled at emergency procedures training. He showed her another photograph, this one showing Elena standing with a group of male pilot trainees. She was the only woman in the picture, but her posture and expression showed no trace of self-consciousness or uncertainty. She belonged there completely, confident in her abilities and comfortable with her authority. The accident happened during a routine training flight, General Hayes continued, his voice becoming more serious. We were practicing engine failure procedures at 3,000 feet. Elena was in the instructor seat, and I was supposed to demonstrate proper emergency landing techniques. Everything seemed to be going normally until the engine actually failed for real. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she anticipated the dangerous situation her grandmother had faced. She had heard enough stories about aviation emergencies to understand how quickly routine training could turn into life-or-death situations. At first, I thought it was part of the exercise, General Hayes said. Elena was always throwing unexpected challenges at us to test our reactions. But, when I looked over at her, I could see in her face that this was no drill. The engine had ceased completely, and we were in a real emergency situation over unfamiliar terrain. He pulled out a hand-drawn map that showed the area where the emergency landing had taken place. Sarah could see that it was rough country, with very few options for safe landing sites. The map was marked with Elena's careful notations, showing wind direction, available landing areas, and obstacles to avoid. I panicked, General Hayes admitted without shame. I was 19 years old, and I had never faced a real emergency before. All my training seemed to evaporate, and I just froze at the controls. If Elena hadn't been there, we both would have died in the next 60 seconds. Sarah could imagine the scene, a young pilot overwhelmed by his first real emergency, with only her grandmother's experience and quick thinking standing between them and disaster. She felt a surge of pride in Elena's professionalism and courage under pressure. Elena took control of the aircraft immediately, General Hayes continued. Her voice was calm and steady as she walked me through what she was doing. Bobby, she said, watch how I'm handling the controls. We're going to land in that field ahead, and we're going to walk away from this. She made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. General Hayes showed Sarah a photograph of the aircraft they had been flying, a small training plane that looked impossibly fragile compared to the modern jets that now dominated the base. Sarah tried to imagine her grandmother at the controls of such an aircraft, calmly managing an emergency that would have terrified most experienced pilots. The landing was perfect, General Hayes said, his voice filled with admiration that had not diminished over the decades. Elena set that airplane down in a field that looked too short and too rough for any safe landing, but she made it work through sheer skill and determination. We hit hard, bounced twice, and then rolled to a stop just short of a fence line. But the emergency was not over. General Hayes explained that fuel from the damaged engine had started a fire that quickly engulfed the front section of the aircraft. Both pilots had to evacuate immediately, but his safety harness had jammed during the impact landing. I couldn't get free, he remembered, his voice becoming tight with the memory of genuine terror. The fire was spreading toward the cockpit, and I was trapped. I was pulling at the harness release with everything I had, but it wouldn't budge. That's when Elena came back for me. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the danger her grandmother had faced. Elena could have escaped safely, could have run clear of the burning aircraft and waited for rescue crews to arrive. Instead, she had risked her own life to save a student pilot who was trapped in the wreckage. She climbed back into that burning airplane, General Hayes said, his voice filled with wonder that had not faded after nearly 8 decades. The heat was incredible, and smoke was filling the cockpit, but Elena never hesitated. She pulled out her survival knife and cut through my harness straps, then physically dragged me out of that airplane before the fire could reach the fuel tanks. General Hayes showed Sarah the actual survival knife that Elena had used to cut him free. It was a simple military issue blade, worn smooth by years of use, but to him it represented the tool that had saved his life. He had carried it with him throughout his entire military career as a reminder of Elena's courage and quick thinking. "We were barely 50 feet away when the fuel tanks exploded," he continued. "If Elena had hesitated for even 30 seconds, we both would have been killed. Instead, we stood there watching that airplane burn, and she turned to me and said, 'Well, Bobby, I guess that's enough excitement for one day. Let's walk to the nearest road and call for pickup.'" Sarah laughed through her tears, recognizing her grandmother's practical attitude even in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Elena had always approached problems with a matter-of-fact determination that made difficult situations seem manageable. The Army investigation concluded that the engine failure was due to a manufacturing defect that couldn't have been predicted or prevented, General Hayes explained. Elena was commended for her quick thinking and heroism, but, like most WASP accomplishments, the story was buried in classified files and forgotten by the official military history. He showed Sarah a copy of the commendation letter, signed by Elena's commanding officer and documenting her heroic actions during the emergency. It was a formal recognition of extraordinary service, but it had been filed away and forgotten while Elena returned to her regular duties as a flight instructor. "I tried to thank her properly," General Hayes said, "but Elena would never accept any special recognition for what she had done. She said it was just part of the job, that any instructor pilot would have done the same thing. But I knew better. I had seen other instructors in emergency situations, and none of them had the combination of skill, courage, and selflessness that your grandmother displayed that day." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the base public address system. The memorial ceremony was about to begin, and all participants were requested to gather at the memorial site. General Hayes carefully returned his documents to the leather portfolio, but he kept the photograph of Elena in his hand. "There's something else you need to know," he said as they stood up from the bench. "Elena didn't just save my life that day. She changed the entire trajectory of what I became. Because of her training and her example, I went on to become a successful combat pilot in the Pacific Theater. I flew 63 missions against Japanese forces, and every technique she taught me contributed to my survival and success." Sarah realized that her grandmother's influence had extended far beyond that single day in 1943. Through her training and mentorship of pilots like Robert Hayes, Elena had contributed to the Allied victory in World War II in ways that would never be fully documented or recognized. "After the war, I made it my career," General Hayes continued. "I stayed in the Air Force, eventually becoming a general officer and commanding pilot training programs that taught thousands of new aviators. Everything I learned from Elena, I passed on to new generations of pilots. Her knowledge, her techniques, her emphasis on safety and professionalism, it all became part of the institutional memory of military aviation." As they walked toward the memorial ceremony, Sarah began to understand that this encounter was about more than just learning family history. General Hayes had spent 78 years carrying a debt of gratitude that he had never been able to repay. Her grandmother's heroism had been hidden by military classification and societal attitudes that minimized women's contributions to the war effort. But now, through their chance meeting, the truth was finally being revealed. The memorial ceremony began with the traditional military precision that Sarah had come to expect at such events. Veterans and active duty personnel formed neat rows facing the newly dedicated monument, a black granite memorial that bore the names of pilots who had lost their lives during training exercises at the base over 8 decades of operations. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the assembled crowd, creating a solemn atmosphere that seemed appropriate for honoring fallen aviators. But, as Sarah stood among her fellow airmen, she felt as if she were experiencing the ceremony through a completely different lens. Every word spoken about courage, sacrifice, and service seemed to carry new meaning now that she understood her family's hidden connection to military aviation history. She watched General Hayes standing with the other veterans, his weathered face showing the weight of decades of memories and the profound emotion of finally being able to share Elena's story. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Williams, stepped forward to address the gathering. She spoke about the continuous tradition of flight training that had taken place at the base since 1932, emphasizing how each generation of aviators built upon the knowledge and experience of those who came before them. Her words resonated deeply with Sarah, who now understood that her own service was part of an unbroken chain that included her grandmother's pioneering contributions. Today we honor not only those who made the ultimate sacrifice, Colonel Williams said, but also the instructors, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and support personnel who made it possible for countless pilots to serve their country safely and effectively. Their dedication and professionalism saved lives that we will never be able to count, prevented accidents that never happened because of their vigilance, and passed on knowledge that continues to protect aviators to this day. As the colonel spoke, Sarah noticed several reporters in the media area taking notes and photographs. She wondered if any of them would be interested in the remarkable story that was unfolding right here among the assembled veterans. The chance encounter between General Hayes and herself seemed like exactly the kind of human interest story that would help people understand the personal connections that sometimes the most extraordinary encounters happen in the most ordinary places. Picture this: a young woman stands at her post, clipboard in hand, watching planes take off and land at a military airfield. It's just another day of routine duty until a distinguished elderly man approaches the fence. He walks slowly, leaning on his walking stick, his uniform decorated with ribbons that speak of decades of service. But, then, something happens that neither of them expects. His eyes meet hers across the distance, and, suddenly, time stops. The walking stick slips from his weathered fingers and clatters to the ground. His face goes pale as if he's seen a ghost. In that moment, two lives collide across generations, carrying with them secrets that have been buried for over 40 years. This is the story of recognition, redemption, and the power of human connection that transcends time itself. It's about a debt that was never forgotten, a promise that was kept in the most unexpected way, and how one moment of courage from decades past would finally receive the recognition it deserved.